Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling a really critical and maybe uncomfortable deep dive into a hypothetical future scenario. We're looking at the transition of China, specifically what might happen following a collapse of the Chinese Communist Party. For a lot of people, that's a moment they've hoped for, assuming that regime change automatically means a switch to freedom.
And that assumption is precisely what the proposal we're analyzing today really dismantles. It's a fascinating exercise in comparative political science. The proposer argues that the challenges facing China are, they're structural and cultural. They run so deep that they would survive any simple political change.
Right. The problems are baked into the system itself, not just the name of the party in charge.
Exactly.
So the central, and I had to say, pretty unnerving prediction here is that the immediate aftermath of a CCP collapse won't result in a true liberal democracy. Not like, say, Japan or Taiwan. We're talking about a transition to something much more resilient and, frankly, much harder to fight.
And the core fear is summed up in a term that's really well known in transition studies. Russification.
Russification.
Yeah. It refers to the specific path Russia took after the Soviet Union dissolved. You see, an electoral system gets put in place, but it serves only as a facade, or as the proposer calls it, a license.
A license for what?
A license to avoid international sanctions, basically. It masks sophisticated corruption and continued autocratic rule, often managed by the very same elites who were in power before the whole thing fell apart.
Wow. So our mission today is pretty complex then. We need to unpack why this Russian blueprint, this slide toward a strong-handed pseudo-democracy or even something called digital neo-feudalism is considered the most likely realistic prediction.
That's it. We need to dissect the deep mechanisms, both historical and, digital, that would allow this kind of camouflage authoritarianism to actually succeed.
And it's crucial we look beyond just the gloomy prediction, right?
Absolutely. If this scenario is as structurally grounded as the proposer suggests, then understanding how it operates, how this resilient pseudo-tyranny works, lets us identify its inherent vulnerabilities. And from there, we can talk about the necessary countermeasures that citizens and the international community would need to deploy to avoid that fate.
Okay, let's jump right in now. Let's start with what the proposer calls the software problem. Yeah. The argument is that China's cultural history ensures corruption, and a specific type of governance will persist no matter what political system you put on top of it. So what are these millennia-old factors that make real institutional reform so difficult?
Well, this is where you feel the immense gravitational pull of history. We're looking at over 2,000 years of a consistent administrative practice. It's known as patrimonial bureaucracy, or, more simply, bureaucratic politics.
Okay.
And this system dictates that the allocation of everything, power, privilege, resources, is determined not by abstract impartial laws, but by something called the tradition of rule by man.
Rule by man. So that means it's based on the personal whim and relationships of the administrator rather than codified objective laws.
Precisely. The core operating principle of the state has always been the necessity of guangxi personal connections.
Right, I've heard that term.
Whether you were a merchant in the Ming Dynasty trying to get a contract or a modern-day business owner seeking a permit, your success depends entirely on your network, on who you know. Guangxi has been the key determinant of resource allocation from the dynastic eras right up to the CCP's cadre system today. It's just completely consistent.
And that structural reliance on connections is what makes corruption not just like a possibility, but almost culturally mandatory, isn't it?
That's the critical insight, yes. When the system itself is arbitrary, when laws can be bent or just ignored by whoever is in authority, relying on the formal rules is a huge gamble.
A dangerous one.
A very dangerous one. So relying on guangxi becomes the only safe and reliable way to navigate risk, to secure your future, and to ensure your family's safety. And it transforms things like embezzlement or nepotism from an evil criminal act into an ingrained, essential survival strategy within a hostile political environment.
And this leads to another concept mentioned in the proposal, the erosion of the public by the private. What's that about?
Yes. So in traditional Chinese culture, loyalty to your immediate family, your clan, your close associates, that holds primacy over loyalty to an abstract concept like the state or the public interest.
Okay.
When this traditional familism is brought into state administration, the state itself becomes just another resource to be managed and exploited for the benefit of one's own network. It's not seen as a servant of the people. This is why mid-level bureaucrats historically have always been risk-averse. They protect their network first, and the abstract state comes a distant second.
So let me just play devil's advocate for a second here.
Yeah.
What if the CCP falls and a Western-style constitution is introduced, with electoral accountability and all that, wouldn't it automatically force the bureaucracy, especially the mid to lower levels, to follow the new rules?
The proposer argues very strongly that it would not. Think about it. If the millions of individuals who actually process the permits, sign the forms, and run the city offices, the whole bureaucratic apparatus, if they all remain in place, their ingrained habits aren't just going to vanish overnight.
Their software still running the old code.
Exactly. Their reliance on guangxi for just getting things done will persist. And in that scenario, democratization results in little more than a shift in where the bribes are paid. It moves from, centralized party payments to decentralized, more sophisticated things like political fundraising or consulting fees.
But the underlying principle is the same.
It's identical. Access to power, not legal merit, is what determines success.
It's the same old engine just running under a new hood. The internal software is still running that old code, which makes the new democratic operating system incredibly vulnerable to this persistent, sophisticated malware.
That historical continuity is the biggest inertia to overcome. It's a massive challenge.
That historical continuity really establishes why this change is so difficult. So let's get into the mechanics of the transition itself. The path Russia took after the Soviet Union's collapse is cited as the most plausible structural worst-case scenario. And this is where it gets really interesting. The mechanism for the privileged class to survive a revolution.
The Russian transition, especially during the chaotic 1990s, provides a chilling roadmap for China. The key initial risk is what's called the emergence of oligarchs. The existing privileged class, so the former CCP elites, particularly the Red second generation or princelings, they are positioned perfectly, not just to survive, but to profit immensely from the collapse.
So they go from being the political controllers of the economy to becoming its actual owners. Can you expand on how these princelings are already in that position?
Absolutely. This is a key difference from the Soviet elite in 1991. The Chinese princelings already run, or are deeply connected to, the most profitable and strategic state-owned enterprises. We're talking finance, energy, telecommunications, heavy industry.
The crown jewels of the economy.
The crown jewels. So when the political structure collapses, a period of inevitable privatization will follow. This is what was known in Russia as shock therapy.
And that's where the transfer of ownership happens.
Exactly. They use their insider access to information. They know the true value of the assets. They have the offshore capital ready. They have the political connections to grease the legal wheels. And they use all of that to acquire these state assets at fire sale prices. They literally transform their existing party privilege into legally protected private generational wealth. They become the new economic rulers, and in doing so, they institutionalize the corruption of the previous regime.
And once they've secured that economic power, they then move to control the political landscape.
Right.
This results in what the proposer calls managed democracy or pseudo-democracy. How does that system operate in practice? It's more than just having elections, right?
Oh, much more. Managed democracy is a sophisticated camouflage system. It's designed primarily for external legitimacy for the international community. You see all the superficial trappings of democracy, an electoral system, multiple political parties, state media that looks independent. But operationally, it's controlled chaos.
How so?
Well, the new oligarchs fund the main political party, ensuring its dominance. Key opposition candidates are systematically vetted and then excluded, often using trumped-up legal charges or endless bureaucratic hurdles.
So if a candidate is a genuine threat to the entrenched economic interest, they aren't removed by tanks, but by the legal system or some administrative ruling.
Precisely. And the media control is pervasive. While state TV might look independent, its ownership invariably traces back to the new oligarch class. They'll allow some criticism, just enough to appear free, but they tightly control the core narrative. They make sure no critical economic or structural issues are ever truly debated in the public sphere.
So you get a de facto one-party rule, or even scarier, a personal dictatorship, but it's all legally sanctioned by this facade of democracy.
Exactly right.
And as we saw in a lot of post-Soviet states, when this gross inequality starts causing public outrage, the new rulers need a distraction. That distraction becomes authoritarian nationalism.
It's the classic playbook. Divert public dissatisfaction. When citizens realize the new administration is just as corrupt, or maybe even creating more inequality than the old one, the new regime mobilizes extreme nationalism, sometimes outright xenophobia.
Blame outsiders.
They blame external forces, historical enemies, Western interference for the country's economic problems, and its endemic corruption. This tactic provides a potent populist distraction that channels public anger away from the oligarchs' pocketbooks and toward a unifying external threat.
Now let's talk about the unique advantage a post-CCP state would inherit, its high-tech surveillance infrastructure. How do the mechanisms for oppression become more sophisticated under this new banner?
Well, the old system was relatively simple, right? The justification for oppression was protecting the party or socialism, and it was enforced by visible tools like the social credit score and, physical police action. The predicted news system is far more insidious. The justification shifts to seemingly legitimate aims, state stability, counterterrorism, protecting traditional values.
And the tools change from those visible scores to invisible algorithms.
Absolutely. The surveillance technology moves from overt social credit to sophisticated big data-based crime prediction and public opinion manipulation. So elections happen, but the narrative is entirely controlled by powerful algorithms that suppress genuine political debate. Even the nature of corruption itself changes. Instead of cash bribes in a suitcase, it moves to ultra-complex offshore corporate finance, political fundraising organizations, and money laundering schemes that involve multiple jurisdictions.
Making it almost impossible for international bodies to trace.
Nearly impossible. They cloak tyranny in legality and digital sophistication.
The proposer provides this fantastic comparative analysis of former Soviet states to justify this structural pessimism. I think this is really key. If we look at the paths they took, why did the Baltic states Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania succeed in establishing full functioning democracies while Russia and Central Asia failed and basically reverted to authoritarianism?
Yeah, this comparison is what moves the discussion from, hypothetical speculation to empirical reality. It's crucial. Let's start with factor one, historical memory and national identity. This is perhaps the most difficult hurdle for China.
What was it about the Baltics that made them uniquely positioned for democracy?
Well, they had a historical memory of successful independence, however brief it was, between 1918 and 1940. So for them, breaking free from the Soviet Union wasn't just about regime change. It was a mission to return to Europe. Democracy wasn't some external idea being imported. It was something to be reclaimed as part of their national identity project.
Yeah.
That internal consensus was incredibly powerful.
And Russia, and by extension China, they just lack that democratic memory.
That's right. Russia and the Central Asian states only had long histories of imperial rule, strong centralized leadership, khanats, and so on. They lacked any successful democratic template to fall back on. So when the central authority collapsed, the primary cultural response was fear of chaos. In Chinese, Luan. And so the populace was primed to accept rule by strong leaders who promised to bring order over the painful, messy process of building liberal institutions. China, with its thousands of years of imperial history and this deep-seated cultural preference for order over liberty, fits squarely into this failure category.
Okay, so factor two addresses the most practical issue. Elite transition, or as the proposer puts it, dismantling the nomenclatura. This is where scale becomes China's biggest obstacle.
Yes. The successful Baltic states, they implemented thorough purges and reforms of the former Communist Party officials, the nomenclatura. Estonia, for example, successfully minimized opportunities for the old bureaucrats to leverage their power by moving to rapid administrative digitization. That eliminated a lot of the black box human processes that were so susceptible to corruption.
But the scale of China's nomenclatura is it's staggering.
It is. In 1991, the Soviet Communist Party's membership was about 6% of the population. The Chinese Communist Party has over 90 million members, which is around 6.5% of the population, 4 times larger than the Soviet Union's was. The proposer argues that the sheer breadth of this system, which is interwoven into every single level of administration, military, and state business, makes a broad purge impossible without plunging the nation into civil war or total collapse.
So instead of being removed, those millions of members just become the foundation for the new system.
Exactly. They won't vanish. They'll just reorganize rapidly as new oligarchs, local bosses, or the administrative class for the new political parties. They'll maintain the existing power infrastructure just under new banners.
This is the institutional continuity that guarantees the corruption persists.
It's the guarantee.
Okay, moving to the external dynamics, factor 3. The presence of an external anchor. This is about the outside pressure that can force states to reform.
Right. For the Baltic states, the enormous political and economic reward of joining the EU and NATO provided an inescapable external anchor.
They had a goal to shoot for.
A huge one. And to gain entry, they were compelled to undergo these rigorous, non-negotiable reforms. Judicial independence, anti-corruption transparency, legal alignment with European standards. The external body held all the leverage.
But the proposer says China is just too massive for that. Why can't, say, the G7 or the UN play a similar role?
Well, China is simply too big, and its economy is too integrated globally for external entities like the EU to guide its democratization effectively. And crucially, China harbors this powerful great power consciousness. This means its ruling class fundamentally rejects external intervention or guidance as an insult to its national sovereignty and history.
So the kind of leverage that would be required to enforce those changes.
It would require a level of global cooperation and unified sanctions that is, at the moment, completely unattainable.
So without that external carrot of stability and wealth, the new regime has no incentive to undergo those painful reforms.
None whatsoever. And that brings us to the final economic factor, number 4, the resource curse.
Resource-lacking countries versus resource-rich ones.
Yes. The Baltic states, lacking substantial natural resources, had to rely on human capital, transparent market economies, and foreign investment to survive. Transparency was an economic prerequisite for them to participate globally. Conversely, resource-rich countries like Russia use the centralized revenue from oil and gas as a powerful political tool.
They use it to buy off dissent.
They do. They use that massive, concentrated revenue stream as handouts or subsidies to specific groups. It effectively silences public dissent and suppresses any demands for accountability or democratization.
They don't need the consent of the governed.
When the state controls all the wealth and can distribute patronage at will, and this sets the stage perfectly for China's modern equivalent of the resource curse, which we'll get into. Based on these 4 factors, identity, elite structure, no anchor, and economic structure, the transition to a pseudo-democracy seems overwhelmingly likely.
That structural comparison sets a very, very dark foundation. So now let's combine that historical continuity and the Russian blueprint with the high-tech reality of modern China. This leads us into the realm of digital neo-feudalism. That is a chilling concept.
It is. The proposer defines digital neo-feudalism as a sophisticated system of digital surveillance cloaked in democracy. We're talking about a new kind of tyranny that doesn't rely on visible violence. Historically, dictatorships used the secret police and the public arrest. 21st century pseudo-democracies use information and algorithms to maintain control, making their rule functionally invisible.
It's the ultimate soft power control. How exactly does this algorithm-driven public opinion manipulation work during, say, an election cycle?
It's subtle, and that's what makes it so powerful. The regime doesn't outright ban critical news. Instead, AI-powered algorithms filter opposing views on social media, on search engines, on news aggregators. These views get flagged as inappropriate posts, low-quality content, or misinformation. They aren't removed, but they are systematically demoted, deranked, and suppressed.
So they achieve a kind of computational invisibility.
Perfect way to put it. So elections happen, people vote, but the narrative environment is so tightly controlled that the outcome is basically predetermined by the information diet the population is force-fed.
Wow.
And this sophistication extends to the corruption itself. The proposal warns that technologies often praised as transparency tools, like blockchain, could ironically be used to aid in corruption's digital concealment.
That feels counterintuitive. How could blockchain make corruption harder to track?
Because of the layering of complexity. If the new oligarchs use complex, multi-jurisdictional private blockchains or heavily layered corporate shell companies that are registered via decentralized ledgers, their opaque fund transfers become more complex, not less.
So the record exists, but it's unreadable to outsiders.
Exactly. Only the internal network understands how to trace the beneficial ownership through all the layers of decentralized tokens and asset transfers. It provides this technical, legal facade to what is fundamentally illicit fund movement.
This makes me think again about Estonia, which, as you said, used digitalization successfully to stop corruption after the Soviet collapse. Why can't China just replicate Estonia's model?
Estonia's model succeeded because it was built on 2 non-negotiable principles: transparency and decentralization. Their X-road system mandates that every single access to personal data is logged, and citizens can monitor who has accessed their information and when. The entire system was designed on the underlying premise that the government exists to serve and be monitored by its citizens.
And China's current digital infrastructure has the exact opposite design premise.
The exact opposite. It is fundamentally designed for the state to monitor its citizens. China already has this advanced infrastructure, but it's a tool of authoritarian control. Even if a new pseudo-democratic administration tried to implement an Estonian-style system, the culture of vested interests and information asymmetry among the bureaucracy would likely lead to log tampering, system blackboxing, selective transparency.
And you're left with that fundamental question.
The deep-seated structural question remains. Without a cultural and legal foundation in the rule of law, who monitors the monitors? Digitalization, in that context, only streamlines corruption and control.
Let's address the sheer scale of the oligarch formation. We talked about Russia in the 90s, but China's economy is vastly larger. How does that predatory privatization scale up?
Russia's 1990s privatization was chaotic. It was a rapid transfer of state assets, particularly energy and metal resources, to a handful of well-connected former officials and banking insiders. In China, the transition is predicted to be less chaotic because the preparation is already complete. The Red Oligarchs, the princelings, already dominate the strategic commanding heights of the economy.
So they aren't waiting for the state to collapse to seize the assets. They're already managing them.
Precisely. Upon a political collapse, they simply shed the party cadre title and legally establish these managed state assets. The financial institutions, the telecom backbones, the massive industrial complexes as their own private property.
Which instantly institutionalizes corruption on a colossal scale.
A scale we've never seen before. Because of this scale, these emerging oligarchs will command immense financial and political resources far beyond what the initial Russian oligarchs had. It would allow them to effectively purchase and fund the entire new administration's political finances.
And finally, let's look briefly at these Central Asian governance models. Places like Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan. Why is that model so attractive to a potential post-CCP regime?
Central Asia provides the most stable, contemporary example of the hybrid regime that the new Chinese strongmen would likely aspire to. It's a model that maintains the veneer of formal democracy. They hold sham elections, they write new constitutions, they have parliaments, but substantive strongman rule persists right behind the curtain.
A system that satisfies the need for international investment without actually giving up any internal control.
That's it, exactly. They constantly talk about reform and opening to attract foreign capital, but they make sure that core power control over the police, the military, the judiciary, all the resource concessions remains firmly concentrated within the ruling inner circle and their designated successors. This stable authoritarianism is the path of least resistance for the powerful. It offers continuity, profit protection, and just enough democratic camouflage to be accepted by the global market.
We've established the historical, political, and digital risks. Now let's drill down into the deep, structural barriers that would severely hinder any movement toward genuine democracy. These are social and economic vacuums. We'll start with a vacuum in civil society.
This is a devastating long-term consequence of CCP rule. For decades, the party has systematically suppressed or eliminated all intermediary organizations.
Please.
Independent media, labor unions, environmental NGOs, religious bodies. In a healthy democracy, these groups are the shock absorbers. They monitor the government, they debate policy, and they provide a bridge between the state and the individual.
So if the party structure suddenly fractures, what happens to the average citizen?
The result is not a ready populace of free citizens who are organized and prepared to establish new institutions. It's a society that has been atomized, disorganized, and is deeply, deeply fearful of chaos.
So when order breaks down,
the primary psychological response is a desperate search for security, and this leaves the populace clinging to a strong leader in search of order. This vacuum is the most fertile ground imaginable for the reemergence of a Putin-style strongman who promises stability and national revival.
that fear of chaos is then compounded by the second structural hurdle, economic disparity and monopoly capital. China's wealth inequality is already staggering.
And extreme wealth inequality is like kryptonite for fledgling democracies. When elections are held amid massive Gini coefficient disparities, which they absolutely would be in a post-CCP China, they immediately foster money politics and populism. The system becomes incredibly vulnerable to being bought by the newly legalized oligarchs, and the populace, desperate for stability, falls for the strongman who promises to fix inequality through centralized power.
And this brings us back to China's unique version of the resource curse. What oil is to Russia, data is to China. Big data on the people. This is the crown jewel the new regime would inherit.
This infrastructure, the mountains of highly refined personal, financial, and political data, is the ultimate source of centralized wealth and power. Should the new pseudo-democracy inherit and maintain this system, it enables a level of control that we've never seen before. You don't need the gulag anymore. They can use algorithms to control purchasing behavior, deny loans, restrict movement, and, most powerfully, to economically eliminate inconvenient political forces.
So if you're a journalist or a dissident, they don't arrest you, they just make you non-viable in the modern economy.
Exactly. They cancel your payment services, they block your ability to travel on trains or planes, they ensure you can't get a job or secure credit. It's a bloodless bureaucratic purge. And it's far more effective and less internationally scandalous than a physical arrest.
This digital resource curse allows the new regime to enforce political compliance through economic suffocation.
It's total control.
And finally, the privatization of violence and the creation of the deep state. The police and the military aren't just public safety mechanisms. They are instruments of power.
Right. When the system collapses, the apparatus of violence, the military, the secret police, the internal security forces, it doesn't simply dissolve. Senior figures from these groups will inevitably change their signs, but they will reign as shadow rulers, very similar to Russia's Siloviki, that powerful security faction that has dominated post-Soviet politics.
And these figures have a massive incentive to maintain their economic interests, I'd imagine.
A huge incentive. This leads to military commercialization. For commanders and security officials who are already steeped in lucrative vested interests, often controlling vast swaths of state land or manufacturing, the collapse of central party oversight is a golden opportunity. They can openly exploit their economic privileges, forming a powerful military conglomerate complex that colludes with the new Red Oligarchs. This complex becomes the ultimate enforcement mechanism, able to physically nullify the rule of law whenever the interests of the ruling class are threatened, whether by a legitimate court ruling or a democratic protest.
This analysis, which is based on all these comparative political structures, it paints a really bleak picture of an inescapable, highly resilient camouflaged tyranny. If these barriers are so immense, is there any path forward at all? The proposer does identify 3 core vulnerabilities within the pseudo-democracy system itself.
Yes, the hybrid system is sophisticated, but it's not a perfect machine. The first crack comes from its own enormous requirements, economic vulnerability.
We're talking about the astronomical cost of repression and surveillance.
Exactly. The predicted digital neo-feudalism requires astronomical maintenance costs. You have to run the AI networks, cool the massive server farms, and employ tens of thousands of personnel for algorithmic monitoring and response. This reliance on continuous high-level spending is only sustainable during periods of rapid economic growth. The moment growth slows and tax revenues decline. A very likely scenario following a major political transition, maintaining this elaborate digital panopticon becomes a crippling national financial burden.
So the system's need for total surveillance is potentially self-defeating.
It could be. The second vulnerability comes from within the ruling class itself. Political vulnerability or internal strife. Sophisticated corruption, like any cartel, relies on a stable and relatively fair distribution of privileges among the elite, the oligarchs, the local bosses. But in a post-collapse environment, charismatic central leaders are often replaced by competitive factions. When that central authority disappears, internal fighting over vested interests is inevitable.
And these rivals will start to leak information.
They will leak information and expose secrets about each other to gain an upper hand. This internal rift is the single greatest opportunity for citizens and independent media to uncover the truth and destabilize the regime by stripping away its veneer of legitimacy.
It's the moment when the corruption could destroy itself. And the third vulnerability is technological, and it's a bit counterintuitive. Technological vulnerability or information overload.
Right. When surveillance technology becomes too sophisticated, it paradoxically creates this overwhelming flood of meaningless, irrelevant, or even deliberately planted misinformation. So while the state is monitoring every communication, its ability to accurately interpret that data and execute timely preemptive strikes becomes paralyzed by the sheer noise.
And citizens can exploit this.
They can. By using decentralized networks and encrypted communications, they can overwhelm or circumvent the monitoring systems entirely, using the very complexity of the digital infrastructure against the state.
So let's move from theory to some concrete steps. Countermeasures by citizens and technology. If the goal is to avoid this Russification, how can we weaponize transparency immediately after collapse?
The most direct response has to be establishing a digital rule of law from day one. This means weaponizing transparency using blockchain and civic tech. Russia's big failure was rooted in the opaque. It is. The countermeasure must be to establish a truly independent digital media ecosystem. This means securing information infrastructure that physically bypasses state control, using technologies like satellite internet, like Starlink, and mesh networks for localized, secure communication. Continuous, independent, and verified investigative reporting is the only way to systematically strip away the legitimacy of the pseudo-democracy's claims of transparency.
And finally, what's the indispensable role of the international community? What can they do as an external anchor, given the physical guidance is impossible?
Since the international community can't guide the internal political transition, it has to solidify the outer framework to eliminate the incentive structure for corruption. This starts immediately with the containment of oligarch assets.
Eliminating the ability to profit from corruption on a global scale.
The lessons from Russia are crystal clear here. The incentive for corruption is the ability to enjoy your plundered wealth in stable Western jurisdictions. So the international community has to establish stringent, highly effective asset tracing and freezing mechanisms that are activated immediately upon collapse. By preventing corrupt officials, the Red Oligarchs, and the Siloviki from enjoying their ill-gotten gains in London, New York, or Paris, you fundamentally eliminate the primary incentive to plunder the state during the transition.
And using global market access as a lever for reform, similar to how the EU operates.
Absolutely. The necessary strategy is bundling market access with transparency. International bodies must strictly require verifiable indicators of judicial independence, freedom of the press, and administrative transparency as non-negotiable conditions for economic aid, market access, and participation in international financial institutions. This applies sustained pressure, forcing the new regime to choose between global integration and maintaining its corrupt internal control. So, to sum up, the proposer's hypothesis that a post-CCP China will transition to a sophisticated, camouflaged 21st century authoritarianism, well, it's alarmingly consistent with established comparative political science principles. It's driven by three interconnected layers: the cultural continuity of Guangxi and rule by man, the inheritance and repurposing of advanced digital surveillance technology, and the predicted predatory privatization that would spawn red oligarchs on an unprecedented scale.
It suggests that the fall of the Chinese Communist Party is not the finish line for freedom, but merely the starting gun for a new and arguably more dangerous form of tyranny, one that's harder to track, harder to expose, and highly functional in the modern global economy.
And this structural analysis brings us back to the consciousness of the populace. The ultimate finding suggests that the key to avoiding this dark scenario hinges not on a specific law or a policy, but on a fundamental shift in consciousness among the people themselves.
Which leads us directly to our provocative thought for the day. If the millennial-old curse is the rule by man, this reliance on a powerful individual, then what is the only way for the populace to truly break that spell?
The solution cannot be seeking a savior, not another charismatic, strong leader, the moment the CCP system fractures. The ultimate challenge lies in the immediate, determined establishment of an impersonal system. This means demanding transparent, accountable institutions and technologies that force the state to run on rules, on verified data, and on decentralized accountability, rather than trusting the benevolence of a powerful person. That instant shift from searching for a person to trusting a process, that is the true, formidable test of freedom for a post-CCP China.
A deeply complex and fundamentally structural challenge. Thank you for guiding us through this necessary deep dive into what the future of a collapsing superpower might actually look like. We encourage you to consider the implications of historical memory versus the technological future as you process these predictions.